Everyone, my name is Nicholas Cummings. I'm going to jump right into it. A little bit about myself and why I chose the grand challenge of social isolation for this project. I currently work as a crisis response specialist for a company called Spectrum Healthcare. It's located in the Verde Valley. There's a picture of it right there. The Verde Valley is a big place. As you can see, there's a lot of space. Within the Verde Valley is a lot of retirement communities, especially in like Sedona, which is about 20 minutes away from that photo. Um, Geriatric populations are a big portion of the people that experience social isolation. My job as a crisis response specialist is to go out into the community to assess clients and make sure they are safe to remain in the community. It usually involves people that are like suicidal, homicidal, or experiencing psychosis. A trend that I have noticed is a lot of people like tend to be socially isolated if they're in crisis. Um, so the answer to like why I chose social isolation is because I see a lot of people in my job and probably will see a lot more in the future that are socially isolated. Why is social isolation important to the profession? Um, it's important. Well, like before we decide like why it's important, let's define social isolation. Cassell and Berg define social isolation as the absence of social interactions, contacts, relationships with family and friends, with neighbors on an individual level, and with society in general. Zvelta and like colleagues found that like measurements of social isolation in data, not only relating to like frequency of social contact, social supports, and intensity of volunteering, but satisfaction with relationships, feeling of belonging and trust. Another reason why like social isolation is important, Holt, Lunston, and colleagues found that social isolation increased your likelihood of death. Specifically, like the likelihood of death increased by 26% if you felt lonely, 29 for like actual social isolation, and 32% for living alone. I think social isolation is important to the profession because like social workers are trying to prevent all these things and improve people's lives. How does it affect our communities? Well, the CDC found that nearly 1/4 of adults aged 65 and older are considered socially isolated. The US Census Bureau estimated that about 9.5 million people over 65 live alone. And then the last study I have is from like Rohr and colleagues. They found that more than 1 in 10 adults reported social isolation. Um, and social isolation increased in groups with more poverty and increased with age. So the older you get, the more likely you are to experience social isolation. So for my interviews, I interviewed a social worker that works for my local hospital and an anywhere care specialist at Spectrum. Uh, both these people have a lot of interactions with like geriatric populations that are socially isolated. I asked both the interviewees the same questions. Here are the questions. Can you describe the problem of social isolation? What could the community be doing better to prevent social isolation? What is the most significant cause of social isolation? Is it possible to eliminate social isolation? If so, how? Do you think technology is beneficial or harmful for social isolation? And then finally, are there any agencies or causes that help with the problem of social isolation? Both of the like interviewees like answered about the same. Um, the key takeaways from like the interviews and like the literature review that I did was geriatric populations are more at risk of social isolation. Both uh, interviewees said a good part of this is because of like retirees moving far away from family members and essentially like their social supports. Um, but also like there's a lack of group activities and like that can help like this population build relationships and grow their social supports once they get here. Um, Another thing is there's a lack of advertising for the events and activities and groups that help with reducing social isolation that exist. Um, like how do you reach those that are socially isolated? That's a big problem. Um, Another thing was like public transportation. Public transportation in like rural areas is not that great. And it's especially hard for like those in the geriatric population. There's a good number of like people that are like in that population that can't drive. So how can they get to these events? That's a big gap we need to figure out. Um, the other thing is like using technology to bridge the gaps that are there. But we have to be like weary. We need to like not use technology as the only solution, because remember, it's not just like getting those interactions, it's getting quality interactions um, to deal with social isolation. Um, so like some recommendations that I have is like talk to people about retirement. When people are getting like close to retire and like thinking about moving, try to get them to consider retiring where like all their supports are. I'm not saying don't move away and retire where you want, but like consider the importance of having those natural supports. Like, are you like ponder like, are you a person that makes friends easily, or are you a little more sheltered? Um, all I'm saying is think about it beyond, is it a nice place to live? Another thing is like building up our public transports and offering transportation methods. Um, you can make all these events, but you need to have the transportations to get there. Not everyone can have a car, not everyone can drive, especially that's true for the geriatric population. Build up more public areas, like public spaces like parks, and like have more events. We need to build more ways for people to build these social supports. Last thing, use technology, but once again, be wary of using technology as like the sole thing. We can't become too reliant on it, but we need to use it to bridge those gaps. Thank you everyone for listening. And have a good day.